Good tidings, all you lovely individuals. It is League Unlock. My name is Eric, flying a little bit Han Solo on today's episode as we take another trip down memory lane in the history books. Earlier this year, we saw Riot and the LCS do a top 10 LCS players of all time, but we were waiting. There was lacking. There was never a top 10 LEC players of all time. And I know sometimes we talk about it in terms of best Western players of all time. Well, truthfully, eight of the top 10 would probably be from the LEC anyways. And the top 5 on this list would stay the exact same if you included even these Western players. So giving a shout out to EU today, going 10-1, the GOATs of the LEC, even going back to when it was known as the EU LCS, and that is exactly the era that number 10 on this list played around. We are talking about Diamond Prox, who is, whenever we do these all-time lists, he's a guy you kind of look to as an innovator and a pioneer because of what he did for counter jungling, making it a mainstream household mechanic and idea, which is crazy to think there was a time in the pro scene where it wasn't that. But obviously, you know, this guy also has the longevity because he did go over to the LCL, win a couple of titles over there, and then represent internationally at Worlds and at MSI with a couple of different rosters, some of them being Gambit, carried over from Moscow 5 when it came into that league. But M5 and what they did as a whole early on for the competitive scene when there were, international tournaments only, there weren't these domestic leagues. They kind of changed how the game was played. Diamond Prox was very much at the forefront of that. And even a guy like Alex Each, who's not on this list, Diamond Prox had the longevity over him because, Alex Each came to NA, and as we've seen many times before, that's where the careers go to die. So he played for a very long time, decade plus almost, if you're including. He's still recently, the last couple of splits, he's had times playing professionally. So absolutely deserving of getting the recognition for what he did in the early days and how long he was playing as a pro. Quick honorable mention, by the way. A guy like Otawamne is just outside of this top 10. He's been around a long time and been one of the premier top laners for the better part of half a decade, but just felt like some of the other guys on this list were so slightly more deserving. And then we move to this number 9, number 8 spot, which is kind of not really a pair, but they're very much related, and you'll see why. It's the two most iconic supports in the history of EU, and a guy like Yellowstar, similar to Otawamne, just barely not making the top to this top 10. But we start with Mickey X, or Mickey, however you prefer to go with him. And I mean, he was such a mainstay, such a staple for the success of that G2 dynasty. And, spoilers, really what a list like this does is really show you how dominant Fnatic and G2 have been as the two king organizations, the pillars of the EU LCS since its inception, because most of the players on this list have at one point played for either of those organizations. But Mickey, such a great leader for G2, and one of the big things with a lot of the guys on this list is you've got to look at their time outside of those main squads. So for Mickey, whether it's on Splice, Misfits, Excel, and Part 2 in the return to G2 Esports, how they performed on those other squads. And Mickey, I mean, he was pretty rock solid on Excel when he came over, and the reason he got that G2 spot is because he looked so good on Splice and Misfits, even when some of those squads were not playing at the highest level. So absolutely deserving for him to be on this spot. And the buddy that he's always compared to at a spot ahead of him is Hylissang. We know the highs and the lows of this dude's career, the Hilly int, but can also play at an MVP level. These two supports have been going head-to-head in finals a lot of the times, and you can see Hylissang's had some rough luck in finals, even though he's picked up a couple of LEC titles with Fnatic. Going back to the rivalry with G2, they lost in a bunch of finals to them, and going back to the Unicorns of Love days also lost in the finals at the hands of, again, a G2 and a Fnatic. But the reason we have Hilly ahead of Mickey is really when you look at that specific body of work outside of G2 for Mickey and Fnatic for Hylissang, because on UOL he was one of the premier supports in the entire LCS, or LEC, excuse me, for the better part of 3 years, and he's been playing a couple years longer than Mickey at that high level, which is enough to kind of, I think, deserve the recognition to be higher. And anytime, I didn't think you'd be talking about a Fnatic support in a higher pedigree or class than Yellowstar, but Hilly, being with Fnatic since 2018, absolutely deserving of that. Truly is one of the godfathers of support in the LEC after that, initial wave of Yellowstar and Edward on M5, guys like that. It was very much Hilly as soon as he hit the scene with the Unicorns of Love that kind of took over that role, took over that mantle, and has been running with it ever since. But him and Mickey seem to be forever linked career-wise because they were just absolutely at the peak at the same time in Europe, and because G2 and Fnatic were constantly going head-to-head in those rivalries. That's why we'll always be comparing their careers until they decide to hang up the keyboards. In at number 7, believe it or not, it's another member of G2, and this whole dynasty that G2 had, you see why they were the best Western team of all time, because they have 5 of the 10 best players, basically, that we've ever seen in Europe. But it is Wunder, and for a role that is so heavily scrutinized and criticized internationally, you feel like Wunder is one of the few, not just EU top laners, but Western top laners as a whole that could go head-to-head and compete with players from the LCK, with players from the LPL. I know he has PTSD, and G2 fans do as well, for that matchup against the Shy, but you remove that, semi-final run against IG, and he was giving nightmares to T1 in 2019 with the Pike pick, with the crazy other things that we've seen out of. We've seen Soraka top 4 him, now you've seen in show matches, he's pulling out Yumi. He's never been afraid to play some of these crazy picks and play them at such a high level that they're either drawing bans or changing how teams draft against G2 or whatever squad he was on entirely. And again, you remove him from G2. The reason he got that spot on G2 is because he was so good on Splice, and that 2018 G2 roster, before they were the powerhouse dynasty, he was already a standout performer with that Yankos, Perks, Hjarn, and Wadid era roster. He continued that with the Caps generation, and even has had resurgent moments on Fnatic. And all of a sudden, you're talking about this guy who's been around 5+ years and playing at such a high level. He quickly ascends into that all-time status when it comes to European players, and because of that peak performance is why you have him so high on this list, because again, it's rare to talk about top laners competing against LCK and LPL players and being a focal point, not just saying you're stuck on tank duty to kind of neutralize whoever you're going up against. We saw him pick carry, focus champions, and be a focal point on these rosters and perform well against a lot of these squads. So big shout outs to Wunder, always one of the most exciting solo laners to watch coming out of EU. Now we go to another tandem. They're still 6 and 5 respectively. We got one ahead of the other, but forever linked because of how their career trajectories went. And we start with one of the old guard, Xpeke. We're talking season 1 world champion, the very first one. No Korean, no Chinese team. So yes, there's a big asterisk beside it. But Xpeke was the original longevity type of player. Okay, he didn't play through into season 8, 9, and 10, but the dude was playing since season 1, and we're still talking about some of his plays as some of the most iconic moments in the competitive history of this game. The Xpeke, the backdoor, everybody remembers from IEM Katowice. But you think about then what this guy did in terms of being that first wave of European mid laners for, and still to this day, we're always talking about that being the most stacked position in Europe. How many times are LEC mid laners heading over to the LCS because they are the sought after talent? That first wave with Alex Froggen and Expeke are where it all started, and the level that this guy played at internationally, even in that Origin era, 2015, 2016, 2017, we'll forget the support and the 80 carry roles that he had for Origin. Those never happened. But 2015, when they made the run to the semifinals at Worlds, you thought he was washed up, and then all of a sudden he puts together one of the most dominant Worlds runs of his entire career. But a guy who always stepped up the more a match mattered, and the better the competition was, the better he seemed to play, which is why he truly stood out against whatever world-class teams that Fnatic were matching up against. And the majority of his career, kind of setting the standard for that world-class mid laner for Fnatic. Then you transition to Febiven, you go into Caps. It was kind of that hierarchy and that legacy status that just playing mid lane for the black and gold. And that was all because of the level of play and just the style, the charisma that Expeke brought to the squad in the early days. Truly one of the old guard that still deserves recognition to this day, even if you want to talk about how different the game is. It's not as competitive, or it's even way more competitive than it was back then, because the game is such a higher level. Expeke still deserves that nod. And the guy ahead of him, who's linked with him for those early days on Fnatic, is Soaz, and this guy has the longevity factor to an even higher level because he played a couple years longer than Expeke. Still was playing around Season 1. He was against all authority then. Didn't win the first World Championship with Fnatic, but came in there Season 2, had so many incredible international runs with them. At times, you would maybe see him slump a little bit when it came to the domestic leagues, even before playoffs. He's a guy who turned it on even more when playoffs would roll around. But much like Wunder, who we talked about earlier on this list, Soaz was a guy who not only stood his own against some of the best top laners in the world, but again was a highlighted point for Fnatic and a resource to play around and a strength for them. And how many highlights of insane TP plays or outplays do we have from Soaz? Yes, almost, I don't want to say he was like, the Shy is kind of like him, but to some degree you had those moments, those highs and lows, those coin flip moments where when it does land heads, it's absolutely incredible moments out of him, and when it lands tails, you're wondering why this guy is starting in the LEC at all. And that 2017 Worlds run, nothing better embodies. The 0-4 start, Soaz did not look like a starting caliber top laner, especially at an international event. And all of a sudden, the 4-0 run during week 2, you can talk about him as the most important player in Fnatic because of that incredible turnaround that he had. Who knows how the end of his career goes if he doesn't have that injury and Bwipo ends up starting. And then obviously we know Bwipo runs with that starting role for Fnatic, but before Soaz got injured, he was playing at a pretty damn high level, and maybe he's got another full year. Maybe 2019's a little better with that Misfits era when it rolls around, but still, you're talking about nearly a decade, at least 8+ years of this guy playing at an incredibly high level and one of the real godfathers of top lane. So well-deserved to be on this list, and another guy who the old guard holds strong even in this modern era of competitive League of Legends. The top 4 on this list is where it gets incredibly stacked. And the dude who's number 4 on this list, if you dropped him in a list with just other LCS players, he'd be number 1 on the list. That's just how stacked this top 4 is in the LEC. We're new role, new place in 2023, but we are talking about Jankos, the Jungle King, a 2-time MVP. You basically have to be an MVP at least once to be cracking the top 4 on this list. Pretty much undisputed the Western GOAT when it comes to junglers. And again, you can have, he's still, even at 4, in the conversation for one of the best Western players of all time. And we quietly forget, because he's been on G2 for so long, been so dominant on this G2 roster, and the different eras of the G2 roster. He was there for pre-caps, he was there for peak caps, and he was there for post-perks. Everything's got to be a P when you're talking about G2. But Even before then, the H2K runs, he was the standout performer when he came onto that squad, even when you had Febivin in there, when you had Ryu in there, all these different roster iterations. He was consistently the guy that you were talking about to highlight, and when he burst onto the scene with Rocket, he was immediately the First Blood King and the guy who was must-see TV on any of these rosters. So he's been a highlight standout on any different roster that he's been on, and sure, he's had moments where he's been completely gapped against some, let's say, Chinese junglers. You saw Ning and Tian both do some nasty things to him, but they were doing that to everybody at the international events, and especially when you've matched up against those LCK squads in particular, he has carried the hopes of Western fans, especially in the jungle, which is another role where you feel like we get gapped somewhat often, but all these different metas, you can meme about the Nidalee Spears. You can meme about him being the best Braum on the team. All those different things. Sure, that's all well and dandy. But he has been incredibly consistent and consistent at a top tier level in terms of smite and objective controls, adapting to different metas, playing different champions, being a team player later on in his career now, especially since Perks left G2. You've seen him step into that leadership and shot calling role even more so, and he's been pretty damn good at that as well. Not to mention, one of the most charismatic and likable guys in the entire league. It has been an honor to be able to watch Jankos play in the LEC for so long, and it will be a truly, truly sad and tragic day when he does end up retiring. But even when he does retire, he's going to be standing strong on a list like this for many, many, many years to come. Into the top 3 we slide into, which, if Jankos is at 4, you pretty much know where the rest of these guys are going to be, and you know that it is an incredibly stacked lineup, starting with Mr. MVP himself, 4 times in the LEC. We are talking about Reckless. Yes, he had a year where he wasn't in the LEC, so does playing on Carmine Corp not actually count towards playing? Well, doesn't really matter because this guy's had so many damn good splits and so many good performances internationally for EU. The Western GOAT when it comes to AD carries. Easy one to lock up there. It's a check mark for Jankos for jungle. Check mark for Reckless when it comes to AD carries. Okay, maybe 2018 MSI, and I can't even think of a Worlds performance where you were truly underwhelmed. Maybe 2015 with the undefeated Fnatic. But those are pretty much only the 2 international events where you can talk about him individually underperforming, and those were mainly because he was at such an incredibly high level of expectations, fresh off MVP performances from the league, leading into those international events when he didn't deliver to the highest level. But the expectations are always sky high for Reckless, and usually he delivers. It's crazy to have a guy who was so hyped up from, we were talking about Season 2, IPL 5. We were hyping up this guy on the then star-studded Fnatic roster that was Xpeke and Soaz, and this young up-and-coming guy that they couldn't wait to get old enough so they could start him in the LCS, and he hit the ground running, was picking up an MVP by his 2nd ever split in the league. He's lived up to the hype and then some, and now he's one of the most sought-after veterans, and he's been playing at such a high level for so long. What more can you say about this guy? He's fully embraced being the face of not only an organization, but the face of an entire league. Hit so many different milestones and records for kills in the LEC. So many good international events. I think it's only once he's not gotten out of groups at Worlds. I believe 2014. His first year with Fnatic, where they had the heartbreak at OMG and weren't able to get out. But other than that, they're a perennial top 8 team at the World Championship. 3rd stint with Fnatic. 3rd time's the charm. Maybe that's when the World Championship comes. That's a little too much hopium, I think. But Reckless, another guy who absolutely will stand the test of time. The top 2 on this list, I've seen some divisive things back and forth, but I think it's pretty much consensus who they are. It's just the order. And we got Perks in that number 2 spot. And what's tricky is if you're talking about top 10 LEC players of all time, well, how much are you accounting for an LCS title and a full year with Cloud9? Because Perks has some of the craziest career accolades when you talk about winning both the LEC and LCS, one of 3 players, Sven and Broken Blade, to do that. And then you can talk about one of not many players to win a title in 2 different roles. You know, that's a guy like Xiao who you're talking about, but World Finals, semifinals with different G2 rosters, an MSI champion, countless LEC titles. Perkz is one of the godfathers of the LEC and will be hard-pressed to get knocked out of this top 3 status again, even when he does end up retiring. There's so many career moments, and for a guy who started with not being able to get it done internationally in those first early eras of G2, but much like Reckless, except he wasn't as hyped up, he comes in as a rookie, wins his first ever split, and then that 2016-2017 G2, you look at a lot of the players now that were on those squads, and okay, Sven and Mithy and some of the other squad guys you've heard have done great things afterwards, but a lot of the early bot names, Hybrid and Emperor, they were winning with. You had Kikis, you had Trick, who after those MVP level performances, what was he doing? It was Perkz being the focal point. 2018 remains one of the most incredible runs, especially that RNG upset for Perkz. Even Cloud9, the runs at Worlds, the individual performances that he had. Then you talk about how he became a dominant bot laner so damn quickly. The top 2 on this list are incredibly easy to get. You can't be going Perkz or Caps in any other order, but you can argue who the 1 and 2 is because of all those special accolades that I mentioned with Perkz. But I'm still siding with Caps in that number 1 spot because there is no player from the LCS or the LEC that I feel that I have more confidence in not only performing internationally, but legitimately striking fear in LPL and LCK opposition. Caps did that for 3 full years, basically. You can even talk about 4, starting 2018 with Fnatic when he showed up in a huge way at that MSI against mid laners like Xiaohu, and then obviously, 2019 G2, he was an absolute animal, but you would see this guy completely take over games against Chinese and Korean teams, which is something I don't know if we've ever really seen Western players do, and okay, I know I just highlighted Perkz did it in a few of these games, but you feel like Caps has the more potential to be able to do that and did that more on a consistent basis. And Perkz even being willing to role swap to make room for Caps on the squad only speaks to the level of all-time talent that Caps has. And anytime a new wave of mid laners are ushered into the LEC, doesn't matter how hyped up they are as rookies or young players, it's always, can they beat Caps? Can they hold their own against Caps? And you hear the players themselves talking about that. He is absolutely the measuring stick, not just for mid laners, but for star players in general in Europe, and with good reason, because we've seen this guy dominate the LEC like we've never seen anyone else do. 6 titles in a row. The guy picks up MVPs like it's routine, and the difference between a squad when he's playing at a high level or where he's in a bit of a slump, 2021 G2, you can maybe talk about, but one player's individual performance can bring a squad from middle of the pack playoff to legitimate worlds contenders, at least going for a deep run at these international events, and that is Caps. And there's no reason to think that this guy's slowing down. He's only going to add to a career resume that can only be compared to Korean or Chinese players, and that is why Caps deserves the top spot as the best LEC player of all time. But that is it today for League Unlocked. My name is Eric. Thank you, beautiful people, for watching as always, and we will catch you on that flippity flip.